will be reading Luke 14, 1 through 24. One Sabbath, when he went to dine at the house of a ruler of the Pharisees, they were watching him carefully. And behold, there was a man before him who had dropsy, which is abnormal swelling in the body. And Jesus responded to the lawyers and Pharisees, saying, "Is it lawful to heal on the Sabbath or not?" But they remained silent. Then he took him and healed him and sent him away. He said to them, "Which of you, having a son or an ox that has fallen into a well on a Sabbath day, will not immediately pull him out?" And they could not reply to these things. Now he told a parable to those who were invited, when he noticed how they chose the places of honor, saying to them, "When you are invited by someone to a wedding feast, do not sit down in a place of honor, lest someone more distinguished than you be invited by him, and he who invited you both will come and say to you, 'Give your place to this person,' and then you will begin with shame to take the lowest place. But when you are invited, go and sit in the lowest place, so that when your host comes, he may say to you, 'Friend, move up higher.' Then you will be honored in the presence of all who sit at the table with you. For everyone who exalts himself will be humbled, and he who humbles himself will be exalted." He said also to the man who had invited him, "When you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return, and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed, because they cannot repay you. For you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just." When one of those who reclined at table with him heard these things, he said to him, "Blessed is everyone who will eat bread in the kingdom of God." But he said to him, "A man once gave a great banquet and invited many. And at the time for the banquet, he sent his servant to say to those who had been invited, 'Come, for everything is now ready.' But they all alike began to make excuses. The first said to him, 'I have bought a field, and I must go out and see it. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I have bought 5 yoke of oxen, and I go to examine them. Please have me excused.' And another said, 'I have married a wife, and therefore I cannot come.' So the servant came and reported these things to his master. Then the master of the house became angry and said to his servant, 'Go out quickly to the streets and lanes of the city, and bring in the poor and crippled and blind and lame.' And the servant said, 'Sir, what you commanded has been done, and still there is room.' And the master said to the servant, 'Go out to the highways and hedges and compel people to come in, that my house may be filled. For I tell you, none of those men who were invited shall taste my banquet.'" This is the word of the Lord.
Thanks be to God. Thank you, Greg. I think Luke must have been the world's first foodie. He was a gospel foodie for sure, but the world's first foodie. We have our own gospel foodie in the house this morning. I don't know if you know this. One of our partners, and God willing, soon one of our elders, Pravash, has entered what is called the elite status on Yelp, all right? I don't know if you guys have been on Yelp or not, but elite is pretty hard to get to. I don't know what it takes to get to elite status, but I understand it's pretty difficult. Hundreds and hundreds of reviews, or it might be thousands, I'm not sure. I looked up his Yelp profile this morning. And do you see what it says there? Frugal foodie, always on duty. All right, that's your neighborhood foodie right there. Frugal foodie, always on duty. Luke and Pravash would have been buds. All right. Like Pravash, Luke was just always thinking and writing about food, which is apparently what Pravash does. He thinks about it and he writes about it all the time. Even in the book of Acts, another book that Luke wrote, he relays a story about one of the primary reasons that God even gave us food in the first place. In Acts 14, Paul and Barnabas had just healed a man in the city of Lystra. And the city is just like buzzing about this healing, as you can imagine. They think these two dudes are gods because they had just healed this person. And they think that they're gods rather than the servant of the one true God. Check it out here from Acts 14. But when the apostles Barnabas and Paul heard of it, they tore their garments and rushed out into the crowd, crying out, "Men, why are you doing these things? We also are men of like nature with you. And we bring you good news that you should turn from these vain things to a living God who made the heaven and earth and the sea and all that is in them. In past generations, he allowed all the nations to walk in their own ways, yet he did not leave himself without witness." What is that witness? "For he did good by giving you rains from heaven and fruitful seasons, satisfying your hearts with food and gladness." See how closely Luke ties witness with food? This is like party evangelism. I think it's so cool that God lets us do this. According to Luke here, food and gladness are how God bears witness to us about himself and how we ought to bear witness about God to the world. I hope that by now, 3 weeks into this study, you're at least somewhat persuaded that hospitality is truly at the core of the Christian experience. That's been the whole goal for the last couple of weeks, to persuade you of that and then to adopt some of the practices, the eating and dining practices of Jesus. Still, I'm not naive to the fact this morning that this is just really hard for some of us. The idea of mission or evangelism is just like makes us shudder. We don't quite know what to do with that. I read this in an email recently, and it really resonated with me. I wonder if it will with you too. I'll throw it up on screen so you can read along with me. He said, let's get it out in the open right at the beginning. Doesn't something about mission and evangelism just feel off to you? Every Christian knows we're meant to share the gospel and look for opportunities to witness to Christ, yet almost all of us find it a genuine struggle, if not a gloomy discouragement. The vital final thing Jesus left his followers to do, the Great Commission, seems to be the one thing about the Christian life that frankly doesn't feel so great. And that leaves us feeling awkward and ashamed. If we're entirely honest, when we think about evangelism, we often feel something close to resentment. Many of us silently grumble that in being recruited to evangelism, we're being put upon. We first came to know Jesus very happily, receiving his mercy and his invitation to new life. But then along came this unexpected and slightly puzzling additional step of having to be a witness to him in the world. Like a car shifting into the wrong gear, we came to a juddering halt. We've been offered free grace and forgiveness, but now there's a demand. Christianity, we fear, was just too good to be true. Mission is the inevitable catch tacked on to the list of benefits we signed up for. It's the complicated and rather unwelcome add-on to salvation that God has included in the deal as the sweetener for himself. I don't know how that sits with you. It really resonated with me, and it sobered me up to really how I think about mission and evangelism. So in light of this email that I received, I want to warn you. Today's text is a hard word. It is a convicting one. At least it has been for me this last week. There's not a lot of ha-ha here. Most of our LOLing is already done for the morning, okay? At the same time, I do want to say that the way Jesus engaged in evangelism, I think can really help ease some of the pain that was expressed in that email. What we've been doing this month is trying to demystify the mission that Jesus gave to us. Trying to reassure ourselves that it's not as intimidating or complicated or burdensome or overwhelming as we like to make it sometimes. Tim Chester says this: Jesus didn't run projects, establish ministries, create programs, or put on events. He ate meals. If you share meals and if you have a passion for Jesus, then you'll be doing mission. Meals will create natural opportunities to share that message in a context that resonates powerfully with what you're saying. What an amazing God we have that allows us to accomplish his mission with cheesesteaks in our mouths. Does anyone know like the best local place for a cheesesteak? Because we haven't found it yet. Does anyone like a Philly cheesesteak, what we're talking about? Why not? Look up my review. Look up the review. All right. Kravash is pointing us all to his Yelp reviews. All right. Do you get like a payout for that or something? Okay, I don't believe you. Just Jesus' mission. There we go. But God allows us to do this amazing thing with wonderful tasting food in our mouths. And so while the call is high, while the call is definitely hard, it is doable when we see how Jesus did it. So today we examine another meal that Jesus ate from Luke 14. And so here's the setting. It's the Sabbath. And Jesus has been invited to dinner by one of the leaders among the Pharisees. The Pharisees were like the religious elite of the city. The thing that we're going to hone in on is what Jesus does to unmask the pride of the guests, and then the host too, to unmask his pride right there in front of everybody. And so here's the big idea for today. I always say like a big idea is something that we hope is portable, that you can take home with you, a central idea to make sense of this text and take it home with you and hopefully apply it in the regular old mundane rhythms of your life. Here's the big idea. Christian hospitality is ordinary, it is selfless, and it is inclusive. Ordinary, selfless, inclusive. So we'll see this play out in 3 warnings from Jesus. And you're gonna have to forgive me this morning, okay? I got a little carried away with some poetry and some rhyming words, so hang in there with me. The first thing we're gonna see is not to weaponize hospitality for reciprocity. Don't waste hospitality on insularity, and don't trade hospitality for idolatry. I promise not to do this again to you, okay? But we'll unpack those, and I think they'll make sense to you as we walk through them. So verse 1 says that the Pharisees were watching Jesus closely. They're scoping out Jesus and what his sort of MO is going to be as he operates in this party. Well, verse 7 also clearly indicates that Jesus was watching the Pharisees closely. So it's like both directions here of these 2 parties watching each other. Look at verse 7. It says, he noticed how they chose the places of honor. He has been sitting there watching them filter into the party. And what does he look for? Unlike some of us, probably, he's not interested in the fancy clothes that they're wearing or the shoes that they're wearing. He doesn't look to see how important or famous the guests are that are coming into this party. He looks for what they love. Often tables during this time would have been like in the shape of a U, something like this. And the host would sit sort of like at the bottom section of the U. And this host in particular of this party this night was one of the rulers of the Pharisees. He was at the top of the food chain in this like uber religious society. This is like a famous and important person, even to people who would not have considered themselves believers at that time or religious. So think of the dining room of your favorite celebrity preacher. And so you can put yourself sort of in that same kind of predicament that these guests are in. And those of you who are thinking about my dining room right now as your favorite celebrity preacher, I appreciate that. Thank you. Well, not what I was expecting in response to that, but that's okay. So everyone is sort of gunning to be at, near this spot at the bottom of the U. They want to be near to this person of influence and prestige. So you got to imagine that this was an important person relationship that each of these guests would have wanted to have leveraged for more influence in their own circles. For a promotion, for a raise, or for just the ability to be able to say, hey, I was at Phil the Pharisees' place the other night, and we had a great time. It was awesome. And they want to build themselves up by proximity to this person to help themselves appear more important in the eyes of their peers. So you can imagine all the pious jockeying for position to get closest to the head seat of that table. And it probably wasn't like super obvious to the naked eye as they were sort of trying to move their way to that place. But make no mistake, they were definitely gunning for the top. So Jesus is just kind of sitting back, quietly observing all of this. He's watching, and he pretty quickly discovers what their treasure is. They love the praise of each other. They love the praise of each other. And he watches how they sort of weave in and out of conversations covertly, making their way to the best seats in the house. Nobody fools Jesus, and we won't either in this. You could have me fooled, you could have everyone else fooled in this room, but Jesus knows not just what you do, but why you do what you do. So here's the first lesson we learn about hospitality today. Don't weaponize hospitality for reciprocity. Don't weaponize hospitality for reciprocity. So in verse 14, Jesus touches on something that I think probably a lot of us could be guilty of from time to time. He warns against being hospitable for the purpose of trying to get something in return, for reciprocity. So instead, he says to intentionally initiate hospitality with people who can't or won't repay you. Look at verse 14. He says, you will be blessed because they cannot repay you. But one of the greatest cravings of our human hearts is the pleasure of having our sense of importance boosted by the status of people we hang with, we connect with. When someone whom we think is significant shows us attention, we get this like little surge of self-importance, don't we? And so instead of using hospitality to serve others, we can be tempted to use it to serve ourselves and to sort of stroke our own egos. We carefully select and curate who we're extra warm to, who we spend more time with, who we cozy up to. who we invite into our circle of friends, because that person can really help us feel a certain way about ourselves and cause others to think pretty well of us too. Some of us need some bigger circles. We need to widen our circles. Instead of trying to cozy up to that attractive person or that wealthy person or that smart person or that famous person, or cozy up to that person who is a decision maker and has influence, all because we want influence or like self-importance. We look around for what could help enhance our own image or our own standing, and we invite those people into relationship with us. You know, we're usually pretty willing to help someone who can help us in some way. And so what happens? Our elaborate parties can be a means to an end that advantages us and not each other. Whether we are the guest or the host, we can be guilty of leveraging our hospitality for self-promotion and reciprocity. But Jesus calls us to love our neighbor because she is our neighbor and not because she loves us back. Anything less than this, and hospitality becomes a performance rather than a service. This is the nuance, the careful nuance, sometimes the imperceptible nuance between entertaining and hospitality. The focus of entertaining is impressing others. The focus of Christian hospitality is serving others. So ask yourself, is the goal of your hospitality, however it's experienced and pursued in your life, if at all, is the goal of it to impress or to bless? The guests at this dinner party are consumed with impressing each other and impressing the host. And the host himself is interested in impressing the rich people who are coming in, the influential people that are coming into his party, so that they can in turn scratch his own back. He makes them feel important, and in turn they make him feel important. Do you see how their hearts are sort of just bent towards reciprocity? They only serve those who can serve them back in some kind of way, be it financial or social or relational or whatever. Their hearts are bent on reciprocity. If you've ever said to yourself, man, we keep inviting people over to our house. We invite them over for dinner or activities or whatever, but no one ever returns a favor. What's going on? You might be guilty of what the Pharisees are guilty of here, weaponizing hospitality for your own good. Your true motive is being revealed. The mask maybe is coming off. Maybe you didn't even know you had a mask on. I've been guilty of that many times. Or maybe you're tempted in a different kind of way. This is where I'm tempted. I get lulled into the lie that my house is my safe space. This is my castle, my kingdom, my sanctuary. This is the place where my will is done and my rest is sacred and my rest is deserved. Of course, I never really think those exact words. I definitely never say those exact words, but my actions often betray that this is the way I truly actually feel and think and believe. So I wonder if we tend to think and act this way because we've forgotten about that tantalizing repayment on the last day that you can check out in verse 14. We live like this day is the day that matters, the only day that matters, not that day, that last day. But we've made this foolish trade-off when we forget the last day. We've been seduced by lies. Have we forgotten that our homes are not our castles? Our homes aren't even our homes. Check out 1 Corinthians 4. Paul says, what do you have that you did not receive? If then you received it, why do you boast as if you did not receive it? So Jesus proposes another way. He says, when you give a dinner or a banquet, do not invite your friends or your brothers or your relatives or rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you be repaid. But when you give a feast, invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind, and you will be blessed because they cannot repay you, for you will be repaid at the resurrection of the just. It's that last day. Some of us weaponize hospitality for reciprocity. Some of us waste hospitality on insularity. By insularity, I just mean that we insulate ourselves from hard people or difficult conversations. So we don't invite them into our homes, or we don't invite them to dinner or into our friend circles. Many of us have too often written up the wrong guest list. We've sent the evite to the wrong people, or at the very least, not enough people. We insulate ourselves from discomfort by exclusively inviting those who are squarely in our comfort zone. But Jesus says that Christian hospitality is not insular. Jesus says to not waste your time inviting, verse 12, your brothers or your relatives or your rich neighbors, lest they also invite you in return and you get repaid in that way. Instead, he says invite the poor, the crippled, the lame, the blind. In other words, those who cannot or won't repay you in any way. If all you ever do is show hospitality to people who can pay you back in some way, then you're wasting your time and resources. At least if that reward from God is incentivizing you at all, that reward for the last day, to operate as a hospitable Christian in this day, like you are aiming for that reward on the last day. Jesus says that if you tweak your guest list, even just a little bit, and invite those who cannot provide reciprocity, you'll be repaid on the last day by God himself. You will be blessed by Jesus because these people had no capacity to bless you back. So it's probably time we all prayed up some self-denying willpower for the sake of some of our marginalized friends and neighbors, all for the sake of that tantalizing repayment on that last day. Surely there are some folks in this church family or on your block that have never received an invite, or it has been a minute since they've had someone invite them into your circles or into a circle. Why is that? Are we so comfortable with our little cliques, our little circles, that there's no room left for anyone else, particularly those who can't or won't pay us back? To live out the radical hospitality of Jesus is to demonstrate that you truly believe that this life is not all that there is, that there is another life to come where the consequences of this life, of how we live out this life, will truly affect that next life to come. Now listen, I want us to hear this clearly too. Jesus does not intend to put a stop to all family gatherings or times when you're just hanging with your friends. This is also a vital, important part of our discipleship. If we're never being poured into, we're not going to be able to pour out into others. Listen, Jesus ate meals with just his disciples sometimes too. That is okay. Pursue those times by all means. But if we're honest with ourselves, there's a seductive pull to insulate ourselves from people who aren't like us or people who can't bless us back in any kind of way. This is because all too often we use our hospitality, we weaponize our hospitality for reciprocity and insularity. We're all prone, myself included, under the Lord's conviction, even in this very moment, we are prone to make life as comfortable as possible, to avoid what will inconvenience us, and to pursue what will give us the greatest earthly payoff. So I think there are at least two categories we can pursue here in light of what we see in the text. First, we need to show hospitality to the physically marginalized that Jesus talks about here, the lame, the crippled, the blind. And there are, even as I read these words to you right now, there are people in my life that I am convicted about in this moment. I have insulated myself from them because they constantly smell like weed. They're dirty. They annoy me. I mean, why would I take my weed smoking, smelling friend to lunch when I could just hang with some of y'all? That would be way more comfortable, way easier, enjoyable. I'll tell you why I would do that instead of hanging with y'all, though I still want to hang with y'all. I'll tell you why. Because they need Jesus, and because Jesus has done this very thing for me. And he's done this very thing for you. It's not like I didn't smell grossly of sin when Jesus cozied up next to me, right? I stunk bad, the worst. That's enough motivation for me right there. And I hope it'll spark some fires of motivation in your own heart to widen your circles. Too many of us are sitting on the sideline, I'm afraid, held back by fears. Here's what Rosaria Butterfield says about this. She says, we fear that these people will hurt us. We fear that people will negatively influence our children. We fear that we do not even understand the language of this new world order, least of all its people. We long for days gone by. Man, nostalgia wrecks our hospitality, I'm afraid. Our sentimentality makes us stupid. She said it, not me. We need to snap ourselves out of this self-pitying reverie. The best days are ahead. Jesus advances from the front of the line. So why are we so faithless, Anchor Church? And maybe even more than faithless, I think we're just comfortable, is what we are. We don't want to be bothered with the stuff of eternity when now is so pressing and mostly so good. Got some good lives. We have forgotten about the last day. So we need to show hospitality to the physically marginalized and also to the spiritually marginalized. Why inconvenience myself hanging out with a neighbor for the game when I could catch the game with some of my friends? Because is this not what God has done for us in Christ Jesus? He inconvenienced himself so that I could conveniently not have to pay for my own sin. Are we the types of people that were just good enough to be in with Jesus? And you were just good enough and I was just good enough to be in with Jesus, in his comfort zone? No way. We were not in Jesus' comfort zone. Not at all. We come to Christ with nothing, empty hands. We bring nothing useful for our own salvation. We too were the spiritually poor, nothing to offer in exchange for salvation. We were the spiritually crippled. We had no way to get to God. We were spiritually blind, unable to see the truth about Jesus. God's hospitality to us is fuel for our hospitality to others. Why does it make such an eternal difference who you invite over for dinner or out to dinner? It's not so much that any one meal is all determining, all right? Let's not get too myopic on that. But the reason our guest lists make an eternal difference is that it is a litmus test, revealing where the treasure of our hearts truly is. It was a litmus test for the Pharisees in Luke 14, and it is for us too. Is Jesus, with all of his commands and calls and promises, more valuable to us than convenience and comfort? Is he our treasure, or is the world and its comforts? Hear this carefully. The answer to that question, let me read it again. Is Jesus, with his commands and promises, more valuable to us than convenience and comfort? Is he our treasure more than the world and its comforts? The answer to those questions is not decided during an hour at church every week. It is decided on evite.com. And hour by hour, every day, by whether we are willing to inconvenience ourselves for those who can't repay, or whether we insulate ourselves from them so that we can preserve our comfy, cozy routines. It matters who you show hospitality to because it matters where your treasure is. And so next, in verses 15 to 24, as we close out this chapter, Jesus launches into a parable. A parable is like a story that has a secondary meaning to it. And this is a picture of God's invitation to the great banquet of Christianity, where all Christians will pull up a chair and eat with King Jesus. It symbolizes who's going to make it to that feast and who's not going to have a seat at that feast. Whether you'll have a name card in front of that plate or there'll be no name card for you at that table. We all want to be at that table, all right? You don't want to miss this feast. This is a pretty stern warning for us here, I think. Number 3, don't trade God's hospitality for idolatry. Don't trade God's hospitality for idolatry. Now that word idolatry, maybe for many of us, might stir up like these images of primitive people bowing down to statues, something like that. But this is not what I'm referring to here by idolatry. For our purposes today, I'm going to use, surprise, surprise, Tim Keller's definition of idolatry. He says this: an idol has such a controlling position in your heart that you can spend most of your passion and energy, your emotional and financial resources on it without a second thought. It can be family and children, or career and making money, or achievement and critical acclaim, or saving face. An idol is whatever you look at and say in your heart of hearts, if I had that, then I'll feel like my life has meaning, and I'll know I have value, and then I'll feel significant and secure. What is an idol, he goes on to say? It is anything more important to you than God. Anything that absorbs your heart and imagination more than God. Anything you seek to give you what only God can give you. Think for a second. Is there anything in your life more important to you than God? Anything that absorbs your heart and your imagination more than God? That is the idol of your heart in life. That's exactly what we see in this parable starting in verse 16. So this guy's hosting this big old party, and he's invited a lot of people to this party, but one by one they refused to come. You can see it if you follow along with me. One had a field to go see in verse 18. In verse 19, another had to go check out 5 yoke of oxen. Verse 20, I think this one is funny. Another had just married a wife and couldn't come. Like, what's up with that lady that you couldn't go to this party? I don't know. But so today's equivalent of that. So if you're thinking like 2024, those things that might ultimately hinder us from getting to this party with a little folded piece of paper that has our name on it at this table. What are the things that could keep us from this banquet? If you were to translate those ideas into 2024, maybe something like real estate, field to go see. Oxen, cars. A wife, your family. Notice, none of those things are evil things. In fact, they're great, amazing, wonderful things. It's just ordinary life that's keeping people from the kingdom. But it is people living as if this world is all that there is. So we invest all of our time and resources into our houses, into our cars, or we begin to drift away from our Sunday church routine because of family obligations, be it sports or, any number of things. And one of these guys found his identity wrapped up in real estate, another in assets, and another in family. All good things, but not ultimate things. But when these things begin to slowly tug us away from God, they do tend to put our souls in danger. The road to hell is paved not with crimes and great scandals, but instead with things that seem harmless, but over time acquire an outsized importance in our life. And we almost imperceptibly at first begin to drift. And eventually we become so consumed with those things that we lose interest in obeying Jesus and following him. A number of years ago, I took my family to see Niagara Falls. I remember parking in the parking garage there just up the street, like up a hill on a street, and making our way down the street toward the falls with my family. And as we walked down toward the falls, Evie, who was probably 5 at the time, she's not in here today, so I do not owe her $1 unless somebody tells her that I brought her up, and then I will owe her $1, so let's keep that secret between me and you. As we walked down to the falls, Evie, my 5-year-old at the time, was begging to just stop on the way down that street, to stop and look at this little wishing well that was on the sidewalk right outside the parking garage. She was so enamored with this little dinky fountain because she had no idea the amazing thing that she was about to get to encounter just down the street. Why waste your time at this dinky little wishing well fountain when the majesty of Niagara Falls is just a few steps away? Come on, Evie. We're not stopping here. We're going to the real thing just up the street. She needed something else that would just capture her attention, enrapture her, and pull her gaze away from that little dinky fountain. Something bigger, something better, something far more beautiful. Whatever it is that has captured you, that isn't Jesus, it's only captured you because you've never seen, or at the very least, you have forgotten the beauty and the majesty of Jesus and compared to that dinky little wishing well that is your idolatry right now, the thing that has taken the place of Jesus. Maybe you've just forgotten about the reward on that last day, that it is going to be way more mind-blowing than your little dinky comfort is right now. This morning, will you turn away from those little fountains that capture you, that are distracting you from the beauty and the majesty and the joy of following Jesus into mission? Difficult mission? Yes. Weighty mission? Yes, but it is wonderful. And we are waiting for that reward on the last day. Listen, what Jesus is saying here is that there is a great feast coming, and that some of us will make it and some of us won't. That should really sober us this morning. If Jesus is who he says he is, if he really is the resurrected King of the universe, then we ought to listen to him this morning and let his word sober us. don't get this twisted either. Your rejection of an invitation to the banquet does not mean a cancellation of the banquet. Oh no, the banquet is still so on, okay? So this morning, let me encourage you, do not delay in repentance of whatever that might be that is occupying the landscape of your heart more than Jesus is. You don't know how long you have in this life, and neither do I. You don't know how long you'll have interest in even responding to that invitation. You may get to a point where you're just so indifferent and so indifferent that you endanger the eternal welfare of your soul in a very serious way. And so all these folks here in this picture here decline the invitation to the banquet for lesser things. So the host of the dinner in the parable says to his servant in verse 21, what's his response? These people don't want to come because they're distracted. He says, go out quickly to the streets and the lanes of the city and bring in the poor and the crippled and the blind and the lame. So what is Jesus' point here with this? It's this. We are the poor. We are the blind. We are the lame. We are the crippled. God's heart, thank God, is expansive. It is radically inclusive to include people like me, jacked up, sinful people like me. So in verse 23, it goes on to say, and the master said to the slave, go into the highways and along the hedges. So he says, go get all these kinds of people that are broken. Let me tell you where to go. Go everywhere. Go to the highways and along the hedges and compel them to come in, that my house may be filled. I'm glad this is the Father's heart, that he wants a full house with all different kinds of people, with all different kinds of sin and shortcomings and brokenness. He wants us all. He invites us all to the banquet. He wants for his house to be full and for the bread of life to be enjoyed in this life and in the next. So he sends his son, Jesus, to give his life as a ransom for many, Mark 10, and to personally call the guests to God's heavenly banquet. You have an invitation this morning. If you have never accepted that invitation, if you don't know what that kind of means, if you'd like to explore that more, I would love to speak with you in a few minutes. There'll be prayer team members in the middle aisles at the exits and some up here as well. They would love to speak with you about the invitation to that banquet, to be there on that last day with Jesus where we enjoy him forever. And so Jesus goes to the highways and hedges, verse 24, to find the poor, the crippled, the lame, and the tax gatherers, the people outside the social sphere of these Jews. He goes to find the sinners and he eats with them and he eats with us. Luke 19:10, the Son of Man came to seek and save that which was lost. He sought them, he received them, he ate with them, and he saved them. And so when our souls were at risk, Jesus did not stay in the holy huddle of the Trinity. He could have. He had eternal, pure joy right there in relationship with Father and Son, or Father and Spirit. He came to the highways and hedges of our dinky little planet. Dinky is the featured word this morning for some reason, and I don't know why, but it's here. You might have a nice house here, and that is great. But it's just a hedge to Jesus. It don't impress him at all, okay? He came to us despite us, not because of us. And he calls us into that same mission. Around the table with a neighbor, with a napkin on our lap and a fork in our hand, because we want them to join us in that banquet on the last day. In between now and then, it would be lovely to see all of these seats filled up, right? With people who are singing and shouting the praises of King Jesus. What an amazing thing that would be. But it's about more than that, and it's way better than that. It's about that last eternal banquet that we have to look forward to. So as we close here, I just want to do a quick exercise, not like lifting weights exercise, but like a raise your hand exercise. I'm just curious here. How many of you became a Christian because of listening to a podcast? One, right back here. That's awesome. Praise God. How many of you became a Christian because you heard the gospel from a TV preacher? None of us, unless I can't see you in the back. How many of you became a Christian simply because you randomly picked up a Bible one day and just started to read it? Not many of us, if any of us. How many of you, here's the gotcha that you're all waiting for, all right? How many of you became a Christian because a friend or family member told you about Jesus? Yeah, look around. There's so much hope there, I should say. So much joy, so much incentive for us to bring people to our tables. Your life actually matters on into eternity. Your ordinary hospitality matters. Don't discount the fact that you live in the zip code that you live in and on the block that you live in and in the address that God has providentially given you or the workplace that you work at. You are there on purpose and your life matters. Christian hospitality is so ordinary. It is selfless and it is inclusive. And we can all do it. We should all do it. So let's close with our three sort of goals that we've been setting for ourselves over these few weeks. One more time this morning, we have based these goals off of our mission statement as a church, helping people find hope in Jesus by making and mobilizing faithful disciples of Jesus. How do we find people? How do we help people find hope? Well, number one, make disciples. That's number two. That's introducing the people to Jesus for the first time. So let me encourage you to have a goal of inviting someone over into your home or maybe out to dinner or whatever for coffee who is not a Christian at this time for the purpose of either beginning a relationship with them or introducing Jesus to them for the first time. Or mobilizing disciples. That's like people who are already believers, that you want to put tools in their hands to help them continue to faithfully follow Jesus. Jesus didn't just exclusively eat with unbelievers, right? He ate with his disciples a ton. We want to model that in our lives as well. So let me encourage you to invite someone from the Anchor family over or out sometime before the end of October. And like I say every week, let's not forget our singles. Let's not forget our older folks. Let's not forget people who are maybe like on the margins of a circle or of a clique or whatever. Let's go find someone who we've never met before and invite them in and enjoy that inclusivity that Jesus has modeled for us with them. And then finally, we got to be depending disciples. Like we talked about last week, pray that God will do much with the little you have to offer. It ain't much, it ain't impressive, but with Jesus, little is much. Little is much when God is in it. So you pray with me this morning. Jesus, we're glad that you challenge us, but we're uncomfortable. We feel you calling us out of our comfort zone. I feel it in these moments right now too. I pray that you would help us. I pray that you would help us be faithful to follow you. By the Spirit's help, by the power of the Spirit, draw us into the mission. And I pray that you would help us to see conversions. We want to see people come out of the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. We can't do that. We have no power in and of ourselves to do that, but we want to see you do that through measly old us. So I pray that you would do that. Would you blow our minds, blow our expectations for what you might do through the little that we have to offer? In Jesus' name, amen.